Economic Affairs, and it's being backed by the former Brexit Secretary David Davis and said to have the backing of Boris Johnson, former Foreign Secretary as well. Well, the report's author, Shanker Singham from the IEA, joins us now for his first interview on the paper. Good morning.
Morning.
Why chuck checkers, as many Tory backbenchers are now saying their slogan?
Well, I think what we're doing in the launch today and the report that we're releasing is basically saying I think we've approached this whole issue of Brexit from the sort of wrong end of the telescope. That actually what's happening here is Brexit is not just about the UK and the EU. It's a major global event. You know, when a G7 economy embraces trade policy for the first time in 40 years, independent trade policy, that's a big global event. And the Prime Minister actually referred in her Lancaster House speech originally to a Brexit prize. So our approach is, well, what is that prize? And I think that prize is entirely to be found in your independent trade and regulatory policy. It is nowhere else. If you don't have an independent trade and regulatory policy as you leave the EU, then this is only a damage limitation exercise. This can only be a bad result. So you've got to preserve that independent trade and regulatory policy.
Well, the Prime Minister would argue that she would be able to still get that under checkers, still have the freedom to negotiate.
Well, we find that you can't. So we look at the scale of the prize is also important, and that depends on the context in the globe. So we look at the fact that the global trading system is in crisis, the fact that the direction of travel of European regulation is more towards anti-competitive prescriptive regulation, direction of travel of global
Well, what some people call anti-competitive is what other people might say is keeping chlorinated chicken out.
Well, we're saying you want regulation that damages trade as little as possible, damages competition as little as possible, consistent with your regulatory goals. So we're not talking about massive deregulation or anything. We're talking about better regulation. Well, and we find that the context is really important because that gives you a sense of the scale of the prize. Chequers takes that off the table. Chequers takes your independent policy off the table because it's very difficult to negotiate if you've taken goods and agri-food completely off the table.
Well, let's look at some of the problems with your proposal. And we heard a very strong voice from the head of the CBI, the employers' organisation, earlier in the programme. And Carolyn Fairbairn was saying a Canada deal, the kind of thing you're proposing, is not the answer. It would create friction at borders, damage supply chains, a seductive idea, but it just won't work.
Well, so we don't refer to trade agreements by names of countries. I find that quite odd, and I've never heard that before.
OK, but the principle of a free trade agreement...
But actually it's quite an important point, because actually what we're proposing in our report is an advanced free trade agreement with the EU, which starts from the point that we are at, that Carolyn rightly said. We're going to be completely aligned on day one of Brexit. And so we start with an advanced trade agreement with maximum regulatory recognition on day one and a mechanism to mitigate or manage the differences that go forward as you go forward.
But her view is those differences would lead to friction and in turn would lead to job losses, and said she's talked to a car manufacturer who is very worried about this very prospect.
Yes. So what you want to do to make sure that this is a successful result is you want to mitigate those frictions as much as you can. And our report talks about very specific mitigants in customs so you can make these supply chains run properly, which you can do with a series of trusted trader programs, with self-assessment, moving customs from goods transactions to systems-based transactions.
Well, this goes to very much the point of another big objection to your proposals, and that's the fact that it would lead to a hard border on the island of Ireland, something that the Prime Minister has said again and again.
Yes, and our proposal is designed to avoid a hard border on the in the island of Ireland, and we have an extensive section actually on how you would deal with the Irish border, which includes a number of customs-related mitigants. It's really...
Well, those are the kind of things that have been described as magical thinking in other quarters, and there's no sign that the EU would accept these ideas.
Well, it's interesting that
there would be a border, wouldn't there?
It's interesting that people say this, because actually the EU, in its own most recent proposals for how you'd manage the GB Northern Ireland border, suggested exactly the same kinds of things and the same kinds of technologies that we are suggesting for the border. And in fact...
But in their view, the border would be in the Irish Sea, not in the island.
But the point is that the technologies and the other mitigants that you'd use, they have accepted actually work. And so have senior customs brokers, people who've worked in this field for 30 or 40 years. We're talking about things on the Irish border that actually operate in the rest of the world. Every day, these mechanisms are used. And we believe that together, there's no one one thing you would do, but together, if you do all of the things we suggest, you will avoid hardening the border in the island of Ireland.
Shanker Singham from the Institute of Economic Affairs.